Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay. This is a podcast where I'm going to talk about Saturn's placement in the first house. And I remember somebody has asked for this, and so luckily, here it is. I'm going to talk about Saturn, and then I'm going to talk about the first house. And across my podcasts, I've done both. I've talked about Saturn, and I've also talked about the first house. But here I'm going to put it together into one narrative. Because when Saturn appears in the first house, especially if it's close to the ascendant, even if it's from the 12th house, but a few degrees away from the ascendant, whereby it's still in orb, then what has been born into the world is a judge, an assessor, someone who is here to create Saturnian boundaries, to create Saturnian structures, that is, to carve out the world of the things that are generally acceptable, socially acceptable. That's who has been born. And that type of arrangement ensures that that motive is encoded as a sense of self, which simply means the base from which you begin to tell the story of who you are. A very primitive type of awareness. You can't really do anything about it because that's your ascendant, that's the way you're born. Right? Saturn has now come in that area to modify the story that the sign on the cusp of the ascendant is telling, to modify it by ensuring that the expression of that sign is denied at that point. And because the expression needs to be within the sense of self, and to build the sense of self, and we build our sense of self by searching our sensory reality, our sense organs, the information coming in. We search it for certain types of patterns, and we do this without a sense of self, really. So it's like an automatic thing. It's the drives and the motives that we're born with. And we begin to construct the context within which we will tell our life story. That's the ascendant. Saturn comes here and denies the expression of this, and it shows up as the individual not being able to construct that sense of self. Not in that way. And in human psychology, anything that you're not really allowed to do, anywhere you experience a blockage, then you begin to compensate in that area. Unconsciously, and at this point, the compensation is taking place at such a primitive point or a primitive stage in the development of that awareness that the individual is not aware of it. There's no way they can be aware of it. Okay? And because the sense of self really is the launch pad that we use to launch even our unconscious narratives, because like I said earlier in some of my podcasts, your unconscious sense of self is what develops first, because that's the context you are born into. It is the family you are born into, the reality that you are born into, the status of life, or whatever you want to call it, that you are born into. That's how your story begins. And your job is really not in that state, because there's really nothing you can do about that. You're an infant, you're growing up. But when you begin to experience a sense of self to the point where you believe that you can now interfere with these stories, or you can change them, modify them, you can add your own sense of self into that, then you have exited, or you are exiting the first stage of your self-development. Okay? And that exit is signified by the sign of Leo. And Leo's mission really is to go and exhibit its sense of self in Aquarius. Okay? But that process cannot start when the ascendant is denied expression. Because what then is going to move? Okay? Now, physically, this is unrealizable. The individual has to find a way to construct a sense of self. And so what happens is that you have the beginning of a Capricornian journey linked to the sense of self, the identity itself. And some people think that their identity is their name. No, you have another name. A name that is formed at a much earlier part of your experience. The name is the nature of your formative years, really. Because that's the family you're born into, the context you're born into, all the things that you're born into that you can't really change. You have no control over. That's your name. Because whether you agree or not, somehow that is the situation that found you so that you can realize yourself. Okay? So there's always a reason, and the reason is tied to the rest of the narrative in the chart. That's how it always is. Saturn in the first house, or conjunct the ascendant in that sense, is a limitation that starts right at the time when the child is born. It could even be the type of difficulty the mother experienced during childbirth, where it felt like the child's existence itself was going to be denied, especially when that Saturn is conjunct the ascendant but from the 12th house, still in orb. And so the child is born unconsciously with a sense of deprivation, a sense that something is missing and they're going to have to make do. Well, that's the start of the Capricornian journey. And it's such a fundamental placement. Why? Because the entire natal chart up until Capricorn is going to be the theater of experience. That's what happens when you have Saturn right at the origin there. But there's a reason why this happens. Why? Because Your sense of self is not something that you are allowed to develop instinctively, naturally, like other human beings do. No. You are now forced to develop your sense of self as an external behavior, an external criteria. So you're going to swap self-acceptance, really. You're going to swap it for social acceptance. And the difference in self-acceptance and social acceptance is that self-acceptance is a very internal thing. It's really very private. The gift of it is that it allows you to forge convictions, a covenant, okay? And those things create realities. So because you lack access to that, because if the journey doesn't start at the ascendant, really, then how is it going to sit in the fourth? Because that ascendant to the fourth, that's the first stage of the journey of self-development, whereby you are telling a story, but it's not you because you have no real sense of self yet. So people are telling stories about you, and their stories are impinging on your reality in such a way that you call them your formative years. Okay? That's what that Saturn is talking about there. Because the natal charts involves 3 stages of acceptance. And in the life of someone with Saturn in the first house or Saturn conjunct the ascendant, that first stage, which is the critical stage, like the legs of the table or the legs of the stool, they have been denied. And so that person's life is going to be more difficult than most. The difficulty is that you lack access to the most important ingredient for the development of self-consciousness, which is a sense of self, a reference, a datum from which to launch your narrative. And so because you lack it, you feel compelled to compensate by trying to acquire it. That narrative is what begins in the second house. Because these are people who are compelled to feel more responsible than others, to take on more tasks than others. They just simply have this awareness that their life is just going to be more difficult than others. Depending on whether it's sitting and coming in from the 12th or the first house for the conjunction to the ascendant, the individual may initially just run away from responsibilities. Just create narratives that somehow extricate them from responsibilities or from feeling that way, because it's not about responsibilities per se. It's the need that the individual needs to feel empowered in the nature of their self by doing what? By earning that empowerment as a way to compensate for the lack that exists, the deprivation, in order to balance out the psyche. Otherwise, the individual cannot accept who they are. All right, that's the way the narrative sits when Saturn is in the first house or conjunct the ascendant, either from the 12th side or from the first side, still in orb. Okay, because even though it's a burden in some sense initially, because you don't know what it is, and that's where the problem always comes from. The individual doesn't know what that is. So they're not managing the problem because they don't know that the problem exists. They just feel the consequences of the problem. It's only when they begin to realize the nature of the problem, then they can now start solving the problem, because you are meant to build your sense of self, the very origin of it in some sense. You're meant to build it as an external reality. So you must originate something, and that thing must find utility in the general acceptability of society. That's the task. Okay? So the individual constantly tries to birth Saturnian things, Saturnian qualities. It's all about creating boundaries and structures and restrictions, defining, formalizing, okay, teaching, separating, identifying. Because they are going to learn how to do that in such a unique way that they're going to be able to identify with eventually what they create. They're going to learn to do that because they're going to have to learn to do that for their own self. And while they are doing this, nobody will know. It will be a series of painful lessons surrounding the nature of deprivation. That's how it works. Because eventually what you must become, it has to be programmed at some level. And you will carry it without knowing what it is until you get to the context where that thing can now begin to connect to your reality in a positive way. Then it shows. So in essence, Saturn in the first house or conjunct the ascendant is a delivery vehicle of some kind. And what you're delivering is the structure of social acceptance in society. You may find different applications for it. You may go in different directions, and other things may be adding their narratives to this. But once Saturn appears that early in the natal chart, especially conjunct the ascendant, then it's a very definable statement regarding the nature of the person's life. It's assessment. They are here to assess the Saturnian nature of things, which simply revolves around what exactly is it for and how is it beneficial. If it doesn't conform to any of those things, then why do you want to waste your time with it? It's about ensuring that rules are followed. It depends on how the Saturn is sitting, because Saturnian lessons, they usually come from the fact that the individual cannot receive what that Saturn is talking about. There's something about it that they're not comfortable with. And the person will feel this in their own sense of self, their self-identity. What does this look like? Well, it's your earliest memory of the stories that you are telling yourself about yourself. Normally, when this is denied, the individual goes looking for it in the 7th house. That's the plan. Okay? So they may seek to overdefine others or overdefine a partner. They may seek to assess them all the time. Assessment may be the only way they're able to understand anything. Well, if they're going to be a very good assessor at some point in time, well, the theater for that experience, where it will be developed, is within their own personal life story. Because actually, you can't give what you don't have. So whatever it is that you have to contribute eventually, society may see it as one thing, but it will first of all be encoded as a personal life story, a narrative. The most important ones are the ones that give you a lot of problems. They are the things, the narratives that when they eventually find social acceptance out there in the world, they're very powerful. And people tend to look at those things and say, this person just invented that. They didn't invent anything. They learned that thing as part of the problems in their lives. That's why I have a podcast that says, look, a very difficult life is a unique calling. There's something that is sitting within you, is just not sitting correctly, and you don't understand it. And as a result, you can't resolve it. But it's not a life problem. It's access to some type of knowledge. And once you figure out what it is, and if the narrative permits, then you can express it and satisfy something that has been plaguing you for a really long time. Okay? That's what natal chart synthesis does, by the way, is to look at all these narratives and to see how they're sitting. Sitting is a broad term that I use to say how comfortable something is in being able to express that aspect of itself. Okay? And not everything in your chart has to sit comfortably. It doesn't work like that. There has to be some type of balance in the discomfort. The discomfort is there to make you get up and move, to take responsibility, to see limitation, to feel limitation. All right? To imagine deprivation, to experience it so that you can begin to ask questions. Because what is the human? The human is a question. It is looking for meaning. And the deepest meaning it's looking for is meaning about itself. That's what the Saturn conjunct the ascendant is doing. It is blocking your access to the root of your narrative. And so you're going to have to make up everything as you go along. The idea is that by the time you have been on that journey long enough, you will be able to intuit or see your meaning in the things that you have created, the work you have done, especially the work that you consider to be your life goal. Simply, that's something that you've been doing for such a long time, maybe even as a hobby. Okay? That's really what it is. And like a seesaw, what you don't have on one side, you go looking for in the other side. So relationships with people with Saturn in the 1st house, you have to be understanding. If you want to love them, if you have to love them, you have to know that there is an essential part of what they are. It's not really directed at you or any other thing in particular. There is something that sits within them. It's like a manager who has no portfolio. And they've gone to school acquiring all this technical experience or knowledge. They've gone around the world. They've developed all this technical knowledge, know-how. And now they're sitting down with all this competence and they have no portfolio. So what they need to do is to build their own portfolio. And that's what the life experience will provide them. So when you look at the areas that have to do from Leo all the way to Capricorn, or from the 5th house to the 10th house cusp, you would see what that drive is meant to be. And no drive succeeds without energy. So at some point in the narrative, you would see placements that have to do with increasing the power of activity through Scorpio or Pluto, so that the individual can develop the emotional intensity to be able to arrive at the prescription that Saturn is creating as it sits on the ascendant or in the 1st house. You notice these individuals because they seem to have ambition. The problem they have is the realization of ambition. That's where they experience the blockage. Because it's not ambition they're trying to realize, it's themselves. Okay? It's like trying to complete a race when you never hear the starting shot. How do you even know that you're on a race? So you remain in permanent race mode, okay? Running at random times or running at inconvenient times because you think there might be a race on. The idea of that is after spending considerable amount of time in that wilderness, you would have learned how to identify the start of a race without hearing it. And that now becomes your contribution to the world. The greater the contribution needs to be, the more painful the narratives that will be experienced. That's really how it is, because you can't give what you don't have. And the idea of Saturn being some type of process that eventually rewards your effort, well, that's where it comes from, because you fail so much, you become good at it. In fact, you may fail so much, you become good at describing the nature of failure. And that becomes an important breakthrough. Are you kidding me? But that's really what it is that aspect of the psyche that seeks to earn its own praise. It cannot accept being given something. And simply what that is because the human condition is a very unique one. And something I've been repeating quite often these days is that the human experience is a generated experience. We are not really here. We don't really exist. We are a generated form of a brain. Your liver might have its own experience. How do you know? You're not experiencing it. But you are experiencing what it's like to be a brain. Your kidneys may have their own way of being. But you don't know what it is now, do you? Because you're not experiencing yourself as a kidney. And the only reason why you're experiencing yourself as a brain is because your brain developed the level of complexity sufficient enough to simulate your sense of self. That's really what it is. And that creates a dilemma for the human being. Why? Because the human being can swear by its own existence that it's real. It has convictions around its realness, and yet it knows that it is not real. And this disturbs the human psyche. It's the eternal question. It's why you have a question in your head. The question is basically the gap that exists between reconciling these two extremes. That gap that exists between these extremes, that is the nature of Saturn. That's really what it is. It's the one that says, wait a second, show me evidence, show me proof. I want to know. Doubt. And so the individual doubts themselves at a very fundamental level. And this creates all sorts of problems for the psyche to resolve. Because like I said, it's very hard for the psyche of a person with Saturn in the first house, especially conjunct the ascendant, not to feel like a fraud. Not because it's not acquiring experience or it's not acquiring knowledge and things like that. It doesn't know the origin story. And so the question is stuck there. When the individual begins to realize what is going on, they now know that they are on a Capricornian journey. And that changes everything because you know that, listen, it's not about trying to be like Mr. A or Mr. B or, No, you're not here to do any of that. You're here to find your own, like a tree that grows from you. It's a very unique tree because it is you. It literally has you, like your fingerprints on it. It will not share the same with anybody else. And then you begin to really see that thing for what it is. And then you can grow. Okay? Then you can begin to have the sense of conviction that combats the doubt. Because the worst type of judgment is self-judgment. And when self-judgment begins, especially with Saturn in the first house and Saturn conjunct the ascendant, it can be debilitating. Because the first house is so primary, it's so early. Where are you going to get the argument against it? And the major form of self-judgment comes in the form of the person feeling like a fraud. Like they are a false identity, so to speak. Because somehow deep down they realize that is the case. That's why it haunts them. Because there's truth to it. They just don't know what that truth is and they have no idea what to do about it. So like somebody that feels like an empty vessel, they begin to try to populate the self with all sorts of things. They might even indulge in physical pleasures as a way of trying to saturate this gap in some sense. They might be people who they have a lot, but they're not satisfied because it's not about a lot. The deprivation exists on a more fundamental level. And so nothing can really fill it up except the truth of what they are. That's it. Because that's what they're looking for everywhere. And as a result of that, they're drawn to the Saturnian concepts themselves. The places where they can experience structure, limitation, formalism, definition, delineation, precision. And they resist change. Because unlike most people who get to experience reality and everything just sits naturally within them and they carry on with their lives, this person, once you rearrange their reality, they have to start the entire process all over again. The entire process of self-identification, which needs to be built from the ground up. Because it doesn't exist naturally for them. They had to build it and it's a lot of work. A lot of work. A lot of conviction has gone into stabilizing their sense of self, whereby they can keep themselves safe from Saturn. Because Saturn is not an external thing like I've just described. It's the nature of this contradiction that exists. But it's not a contradiction. There's no contradiction. It's a paradox, yes, but there's no contradiction. There is no contradiction because you are a generated experience, but you're generated from the environment that you were born into. And once you realize this, you realize that the entire intelligence for your self-development is always encoded in the environment that you're experiencing. And so the environment for you is a theater of experience within which you can glean learnings that will allow you to become the person that you want to become. That's why there's no contradiction. This is the resolution of your Saturn. The fact that you now understand that there's no contradiction, it means that your natal chart has now sat properly. And that is usually indicated by where you have Pallas. It indicates a realization point where something that you didn't really know that you had the definition of such a question or what that question actually meant, but at some point you realize the answer. The question becomes obvious because you've been asking it all your life, and now the journey begins. And the journey for Saturn in the first house is self-realization. The desire to realize the reason for why you were born. If you don't know that reason, what are you going to realize? Okay? So people like this, they are very highly motivated to tell different types of stories. And Saturn in the first house is also a statement about the nature of Mars, because normally Martian functions, they are impulsive in the sense that they are delivery vehicles. They just want to explode into a scene or explode into a reality or change the state of something. Like physics is described as energy transactions. Okay? It's the same thing. Mars exists just to be able to move things along. But once things are moving along, then there's no need for that anymore. Well, the moving along is being controlled. There is a conditional statement attached to that moving along once your Saturn is in the first house or it is conjunct your ascendant. That conditional statement is what you are going to be fighting or realizing the whole of your life because of its primacy where it is in the first house conjunct the ascendant. One of the reasons why you usually find control systems or conditional statements imposed on the Martian function is to train that Mars so that it can be modified a bit, not just from a sprinter in some sense, but to a relay runner or someone who can run a short marathon. Okay? And that requires slowing the Mars down. And that's the last thing that the functional light wants to do because it goes against what it is. And so it generates a response. Now, the response eventually is what leads to moderated activity, which is where the conditional statement wants to take the Martian function to in the first place. And the only reason why you want to condition an energy source is because you want to use it for control and power, for directional control and achievement of ambition. So Saturn in the first house and Saturn conjunct the ascendant, they're not about wasting energy or wasting activity or wasting potential. No, they want to take longer to observe. They want to take longer to assess. They want to play the devil's advocate. It's not about the thing they're doing. That's how they treat themselves. That's why I started this by saying that a judge is born. There's nobody judging this person more harshly than they judge themselves. And so the last thing this person needs is to be assessed, to be judged. And that's what creates the projection to the seventh house. Because the seventh house is where the opportunity to be judged begins. All right. And that accounts for all the problems, all the benefits they have in the seventh house, because it starts off being a problem. But the reality of it is that it's an asset. Because eventually, when they learn how to control that within themselves, they learn how to control it external of themselves. And that makes them a great people person. All right. That's why they're able to adjudicate in situations in a balanced and fair way in some sense. Okay? Because they're able to take out themselves, in some sense, away from the situation. And it's why astrologers say that Saturn is exalted in Libra. Because in Libra, he has this role as being able to just look at things in the generally acceptable way and to maintain rules or order in some sense. Well, you get the same thing when you connect Saturn to Mars in some sense. It's now able to act in a way that is moderated. But it takes time because Mars doesn't want to be trained in that sense. That's not what it's meant for. It's just that if you have to power some type of activity or some type of behavior, you need an energy source. Okay? And if you're taking it from Mars, because normally you would take it from emotional intensity because what you're trying to develop is on a much higher level. But the Martian function doesn't exist for that emotional intensity. The Martian function exists for the type of intensity found in the sign of what? Cancer. Self-acceptance. So the Saturn-Mars relationship, like you have with the Saturn in the first house, is basically in pursuit of self-acceptance. Whatever it is that the self is dealing with, it wants that self to be able to sit, because when it sits properly, then the convictions can emerge, and convictions create realities. So the process of being cautious, the process of being maybe even introverted or reserved or always being some type of, I wouldn't say a pessimist, I would say a non-romantic optimist who just says that, look, there's a way reality is, there's a way the world is, okay? And I'm going to keep my perception on that level. I know that there are potentials for up or down, right? But I'm not going to move from this level because it allows me to safely maintain what I have, okay? So that's someone who is not willing to run off with a new lover in some sense. Nah. Except, other parts of the natal chart are making statements. But what I've found is that when Saturn appears that early in the natal chart, or conjunct the ascendant especially, well, that is a very prominent statement that is recognizable from the very word go. The individual is just designed to seek a type of reality that is generally acceptable, because they're plagued with shame from the very beginning. It's like carrying a bag of bricks. Because it's not something that you have done or something that you will do. It's the fact that you cannot hear the starting whistle. Okay? So you are born with a diminished sensorial experience. It's no fault of yours. That's the way the story has to be. Because that vacuum will be filled by something wonderful. In fact, the thing that is filled in the vacuum eventually, right, is the Saturnian gift that you couldn't accept right from the very beginning, right from the origins. And that's because right from the onset, you are more aware than most that your entire sense of self is a generated experience. And so you have imagined yourself watching yourself until some type of authority figure can take that place of the watcher. And this creates in you a sense of self-judgment. It's there initially, right from the beginning, but you cannot accept it. At some level of your being, you are telling a narrative that refuses that thing to be able to sit comfortably. And you don't know that you're doing this because it's very early in your experience. And so as you grow older, you must now confront that posture that you have built already within yourself. And that's how the Saturn is crystallized. It seeks to limit so as to calm its anxiety. It seeks to structure so that it doesn't feel lost. It seeks to formalize because it doesn't want to feel shame. But these things are behavioral responses, and over time they form a long pattern which the individual ultimately imagines as their personality. But guess what? It's not a personality. It's a control system, and it has been encoded as you, and it becomes your generated experience. And the day you realize that, that's the day that you know what it is and how valuable it is. That's the gift of Saturn in the first house. I mean, the downsides are that this person, they're always compensating. The Mars is there, but it's not quite there. It doesn't matter where that Mars is sitting or how powerfully expressed that Mars is. Saturn overrides that. It brings it to heel eventually. And Saturn in the first house wants to be able to look at itself in the mirror and see itself as worthy. That's why it sets off on this journey, because it wants to be able to accept something. But the other side of the ledger, which it has created, because the ledger doesn't really exist, but it has created it as a way to counterbalance the acceptance, because it has been born with a kind of awareness that it is not worthy. That's really how it is. That's what it is, So this person may also be pushed to make a name for themselves as a statement of opposition regarding the denial. And that may lead to the other side of the behavior, brashness. It's a compensatory strategy. Okay? I always use the analogy of a pendulum. When the pendulum is at rest, it's right there in the middle, right? It's not moving. But the moment you pull it to one side, which is some type of deprivation or overabundance, once you release that, then it begins to oscillate from one extreme to another until it settles back down in equilibrium. Why does it do that? The laws of physics says that it does that, but what are you made from? Are you not physics? Aspects of you that behave dynamically like a pendulum, well, they'll also obey that physics, won't they? And so when Saturn latches on to Mars in that sense, the Martian impulse may reject that and become impulsive. And then it compensates by trying to annul the impulsiveness by being overly meek the next minute or thereabouts. And the individual yo-yos between these extremes because they're really looking for the balance. So at some point they begin to project that into the 7th house. They begin to seek that balance in the nature of relationships they're having with others, because that's exactly the materialization of it. They are born to become the thing that exists between the spaces. Their job is not to come in and take sides per se. It's to learn to silence themselves so they can see the truth and the structure for what it is. Learning to do this means that that self will be placed in opposition to them in some sense. That's why the Satan or the Saturn is there, to accuse them whenever it is that they are deviating from this. But the accusations are not designed to destroy them. The accusations are designed to bring them back into the orbit, because that's part of their life story. Okay? Like I've said, there are many ways, many iterations, almost countless, of how the narratives flow peripherally, that is. But the main narrative, when Saturn sits in the first house, is about learning to elevate the self through life experience, because the elevation is into that of a judge, an assessor. And a judge cannot have a compromised sense of self. At least that's the idea. Okay, so that now represents a pinnacle for what they're trying to achieve in terms of a sense of achievement. Now, wherever they go, whatever profession they ultimately end up in, even if all they do is manage a household, they will raise themselves to the level of that judge. And when I say judge, it's basically just being able to assess things materially and reputationally in the world. That is, the way that things sit conditionally in the world. So these people tend to be realists. There tend to be those who remind you of some type of collective general behavior of society, so to speak. They can't help but do that because it's not you they're really talking to. This is how they're talking to themselves. And the way these things are is that convictions are built from evidence. But because this child has been born like this, they need conviction, they need evidence so that Saturn can sit. Usually this is provided by one of the parents who remind them of these things I've just said. And so that when they eventually begin to grow, the Saturn is carried primarily in the voice of that parent or that authority figure who reminded them that Saturn was sitting in their ascendant or in their first house. And depending on whether they are in the acceptance phase or the opposing phase, well, the dynamics begin to play out. Okay? Because Saturn in the first house did not come here so that others can judge them in some sense. They came here to be able to judge others. But they have to realize that in order to judge others, they have to be able to judge themselves, because you cannot give what you don't have. So the life lesson somehow is always tied to learning how to be able to adjudicate without bias by holding back the motive. They know this instinctively, but when, the Mars is what it is, okay? And the clash has basically been set up as an essential part of the life story and the development of the life pattern. But it's still externalized in one way because that's the nature of Saturn. Something is blocked inside, it has to come out so that it can be resolved. It's just creating a new theater of experience. Inside, you're only dealing with it by yourself. But when you externalize it, there's a possibility that you can find help. Okay? So what it wants to do is to externalize it, to refine the behavior so that by the time it gets to the 10th house cusp, it is sitting as something tangible that is socially accepted. So Saturnians are always gauging the temperature of the powers that be and the authorities that be in the world. Okay? So that's really what it is. Because of the way that it's sitting in terms of the statement being made with Saturn in the first house, there is a problem regarding the proper valuation of self. Because the first house is a potential that now begins to seek actualization and realization everywhere else. But its first realization is in Taurus, is in the second house. And Saturn in the first house is a major statement regarding holding back the identification process that leads to the need for self-realization by pursuing the vector of Taurus or Venus. Okay? So when you dam a river, upriver, then there's no water downriver in that sense. The river's behavior is changed downwater. So when you see those kind of things, you realize that the individual, where they're going to struggle, the first place they're going to struggle is in that second house. And any functional light there is talking about that struggle. Okay, that'll give you some insight into how the challenge itself is being resolved. Because it has to be resolved. That's Saturn, all right? It has to be resolved. Otherwise, the individual will not be able to rise to their potential. They will not be able to receive the gift that the Saturn bestows, because it's a very worldly gift. And you wouldn't have it on your ascendant if you're not looking for some type of worldly experience, acceptance. Okay? But one of the best ways to realize worldly acceptance is to create a dissonance in the internal self-acceptance process so that the individual can go searching for it external of themselves. And while they're searching for it external of themselves, ultimately they will realize it's an internal process. But while they're searching for it, they will create something. That's the point. They will affect the lives of certain people in certain ways, which they wouldn't have if they were not like that. And that's the aim. That's the design. Because you think you're chasing yourself and your dreams, your aspirations and all that. But you're interacting with people. You're running into people, people are running into you, and we're all engaged in this mesh, this network, this invisible network that we cannot really put a finger on, right? But it exists. And sometimes your life story is all about how you connect with others and the impact of that connection, because that's needed for further processing of those people's life stories. And on it goes. Okay? So all in all, Saturn in the first house, it's a beautiful placement because the individual might also seek to work out the body, tone the body, keep it slim. because Mars is the rate of metabolism because it's energy, all right? So Saturn in the first house might be a statement on that metabolic flow, that metabolic pathway. It may be somebody who has initially problems with sugar, diabetes, insulin. There may be other metabolic issues as well, but what happens is that this person gets better with time. By the time they're fully grown adult, they've resolved all these things. Their bodies somehow have learned to cope. As a result of the rate of metabolism, the individual is usually very skinny, or not skinny, but they're trim at best. Why? Because they burn much faster. It's almost like they have a higher mountain to climb. And where does this extra load come from? It comes from the brain. You know, your brain already consumes 20% of all the glucose in your body. Well, for people with Saturn in the first house, there's a higher hill to climb. So that may go as high as, whatever. But the side effect of this is that it keeps the individual from really putting on weight in that sense. Body mass, that is. This may change as they get older, but while young, they remain like that. And some may eventually cycle back to that behavior as a way of being. It all depends on what everything else is saying in the natal chart. But all in all, Saturn in the first house, the danger is cruelty and depression. Because since you are deprived in some sense very early and very initially, not only can you not hear the starting shot, but you can't really gauge your own strength. Because everything you have built related to your sense of self, you have built it by inventing it in some sense. You don't really feel it or you don't really connect to it because you're blocked at the very early stages of it. So you compensate by actually trying to build those things. And it shows up as your need to be responsible, your need to be dutiful, or the complete opposite, the complete absence of it. Depends on how the person is processing the situation, you see.